Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Hugh Hewitt, the president of the Nixon Foundation. Welcome to the fourth gathering of the Nixon Seminar, co-chaired by former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and former National Security Advisor Ambassador Robert O'Brien. As we prepare for a seminar at the Nixon Library about the 50th anniversary of the reversion of Okinawa to Japan on the 17th of this month, the seminar tonight will focus on the U.S.-Japan relationship and Japan's situation, problems, and challenges, as well as promises going forward. With that, I'll turn it over to Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador O'Brien, our co-chairs.
Great, thank you, Hugh. Thought I'd open with just a few comments from these last 4 years, the experiences that I had and that my teams had. We knew this was an important relationship, and we had a great opportunity because we were also working with a Prime Minister Abe, who knew how important the relationship between the United States and Japan were. He and President Trump got along wonderfully. It gave all of us who were working, I'm sure Ambassador O'Brien will concur, give us all the opportunity to go build this relationship out in the places that mattered most. My first opportunity to meet with my Japanese counterpart was actually at CIA. It was now National Security Advisor Kitamura-san, who was my counterpart for the Japanese intelligence services. We were working together when we were dealing with the problem of Chairman Kim in North Korea. That was the first time that we had the opportunity for me to actually see up close how the Japanese government was thinking about the threats to their region. And what was heartening to me was it was very clear that while we were addressing the challenges of the missiles that were being fired and the nuclear risks in North Korea, the Japanese never lost sight that the greater challenge was the Chinese Communist Party, that they knew that this was something that was a threat that they needed a good ally and good friend with. And so while we were working along with the South Koreans and them to build out a strategy on North Korea, they were ever mindful of the fact that the Chinese had a big role in this and played a functionally masterful role with how Chairman Kim was thinking about what we were doing and what mattered between the United States and Japan. Two other issues, and then I'll turn it over to Ambassador O'Brien. At the same time, we were working on complex trade issues. Just as the president was confronting the Chinese with tariffs, we also had complicated trade relationships with the Japanese as well. There were also defense issues that were around it. We were trying to assist the Japanese in building out their own capabilities, and they had complex internal political situation, which didn't always make that straightforward. Prime Minister Abe was very, very determined to make it happen. But time and time again, we talk about, you mentioned Hugh, Okinawa, we saw time and time again, prefecture issues, local issues that mattered an awful lot and made the logistics of how we were going to execute and help the Japanese execute their defense program made it very complicated, and internal issues inside of Japan. And I'm sure we can talk about that some more this evening. Lastly, China. They were resolute in understanding what mattered about Taiwan, what mattered in Hong Kong, but it was very difficult for them to find a footing, for them to find a place where they could talk about this in the same way that the Trump administration was able to talk about this. And I'll leave for a further discussion all of the dynamics that were at play, but the Japanese came to understand that they were going to have to lead, that their role in the Quad was going to be central. We could push a lot in the United States. We could do our level best to make the Quad grow and prosper, but the Japanese were going to have to demonstrate that they were prepared to work with the Indians and with the Australians in a way that would matter for Japanese defense as well. Last piece, it was always complicated because of the deep historic issues between Japan and South Korea as well. There's a famous picture of me with my counterparts from those two countries where it looks like the last thing they wanted to do was be in the frame together. This is something that the United States has to be mindful of as we try to encourage the nations in the regions to work alongside of us to defend the West against the threat from the Chinese Communist Party. There are, bilateral dynamics that are deep, historical, and always in the minds of the populaces of these two countries, even if the leaders want to take their country in a direction that is the one that the United States is trying to urge them to get towards. And so with that, Robert, Ambassador O'Brien, I'll turn it over to you, and then we'll open up to the larger group. Robert?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Secretary. And I want to compliment Secretary Pompeo, Mike, on the work he did with Japan and with his counterpart, Foreign Minister Mitsu. It was really impressive work. The Quad turned out to be, I think, one of the real singular achievements. Expanding the Quad turned out to be one of the singular achievements.
Robert, I can't hear you. I don't know if everybody else can or not, but I'm unable to hear you.
Do we have comms? Okay, I'm being told we're good to go. Secretary, can you hear now?
Hey, Robert, it looks like we're not getting your sound.
Yeah, can you let the guys?
Can you hear him? Looks like everyone's shaking their head.
No.
I cannot, Mr. Secretary, so
Yeah,
I
Sounds
will.
great.
Hey guys, we're not.
Now we got you.
We're not.
He's got it
broadcasting
now.
out comms wise. How are we doing? We good now? All right. Mike, can you hear me?
Yes, we have you now, Robert.
All right. Great. Well, listen, I wanted to, what I was saying, maybe the Chinese had cut that off, but I was complimenting Secretary Pompeo on the work he did on this critical relationship between the United States and Japan, especially in helping using Japan's influence and building out the Quad, which I think is going to be viewed historically as one of the singular foreign policy achievements of the Trump administration. And no one worked harder than that than Secretary Pompeo, and worked hard at that relationship. So again, a lot of the credit for what was done over the past 4 years with the Japanese foreign minister, with Kitamura-san, who Mike worked with as head of their intel service, and I later worked with when he was the head of the National Security Secretariat. That groundwork was laid by Mike. So that was excellent work. I think as we talk today about, and we're going to talk again next week or in 2 weeks on June 17th about the Okinawa Reversion Treaty. That's an accomplishment. It's another one of these Nixon accomplishments that was really terrific at the time, but has looked more and more important over the years as we look back at President Nixon's legacy. Getting Okinawa back to Japan so that it could be governed for the past 50 years in a post-war Japanese governments is all the more critical when we look at what the PRC and the Communist Party of China has been doing, whether it's Tibet or India, the South China Sea, the Senkakus, how they've steadily been expanding their sovereignty over the territory of other nations and being very assertive in the region. The Chinese have started to talk about Okinawa and the Ryukyus in a similar sense as they do the South China Sea and certainly the Senkakus, as they would refer to them as the Diaoyu Islands. And this really started back in 2012, 2013, when Chinese researchers apparently discovered or started publicizing the fact that in the 15th and 16th century, an independent kingdom in the islands that included Okinawa paid some tribute to the Japanese emperor, and they started using that as the grounds to claim some sort of sovereignty over Okinawa and the Rikaku Islands. Normally, that would be something that would be rejected out of hand, and eyes would roll in international forums. But this is the same sort of approach that China has taken on the South China Sea. The fact that the Okinawa reverted to Japan has been under Japanese governance for the past half century. I think makes Japan's confidence in their ability to govern those islands all the more secure. It also removes it would have been much more difficult to be dealing with those sorts of claims by the Chinese if the U.S. was still asserting some sort of trusteeship, post-war trusteeship over the island. So again, I think looking back in history, I know it was controversial at the time, and there were some folks at DOD that didn't think the reversion made sense. I think in hindsight, it was a great achievement of President Nixon and his administration, Secretary Kissinger and others. The second thing I'd like to mention is just the flip side of the coin that Secretary Pompeo spoke about, and that was the relationship between the National Security Council, at least during the year and a half that I was there, and the Japanese equivalent, the National Security Secretariat, and my relationship with Shigeru Kitamura. If you haven't heard Kitamura, you should get to know him. He's probably the most powerful, capable, tough national security advisor, or one of the most powerful, capable, and toughest national security advisors in the world. But he's a name that's not necessarily familiar to Americans or even people who are well versed in foreign policy. But he had an extremely close relationship with Prime Minister Abe and had tremendous influence there. He's had that same sort of relationship, with Prime Minister Suga. He understands the challenges that the PRC and the Communist Party of China present to the region and to the world, as well as anyone. So he was incredibly supportive, and the Japanese NSS was very supportive of the Quad. Once COVID-19 really hit, the Japanese took a leading role in nearshoring and reshoring industries from China. They continue to do that because they don't want the CCP to have leverage over Japan the way that they have, because of the manufacturing supply chains in Japan stretch deep into China, and they're trying to change that dynamic. So they've been very forward-leaning. They've been forward-leaning on defense, as the Secretary Pompeo pointed out. They also understand the importance of Taiwan and ensuring that Taiwan is not subject to an invasion and taken over by the Communist Party of China, by the PRC. If that happened, geopolitically, it would be extraordinarily difficult for the Japanese. They'd essentially be surrounded by the Chinese, and so that's something that I think the Japanese understand very well, and under both Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Suga, they've been very supportive of the U.S. and supportive of Taiwan and President Tsai. We had a shared strategic vision with the Japanese during our time in office, Secretary Pompeo's and my time in office with the President. I don't think we have anywhere the interoperability of our military, and especially our naval services, are as close as they are with the Japanese. And we've got some close naval relationships with Australia, with the UK, with Canada, and I think Japan falls right into that category. So much so that even with the language barrier, Japanese ships serve alongside our ships in carrier battle groups and strike groups. I'll just mention two clouds for Japan, and Secretary Pompeo beat me to the punch on both these, but I spent a lot of my time dealing with my counterparts in South Korea and Japan, trying to bring them together, including one meeting that Matt Pottinger and Alex Gray, who are on the line here, will remember, where both of them desperately wanted a meeting and a photo with President Trump, and we had to get the GSOMIA, the General Security Military Information Agreement, extended, and we did that, and then we're able to take them into the Oval Office. And I think they wanted individual photos with President Trump, and he insisted that they take photos together to show the strength of the alliance. That's a tough relationship, and it arises out of some very difficult circumstances from the Second World War. But we need to keep working that, and the U.S. is the essential partner in that tripartite relationship, and we can't allow China to drive a wedge between Korea and Japan further than it is, and we don't want a wedge between either the U.S. and Korea, or the U.S. and South Korea and the U.S. and Japan. So that's going to be a tough issue, but we'll keep working it, and the U.S. is an indispensable party there. The other area that we've got to focus on are Japanese military expenditures. We've seen the largest peacetime buildup of a military since the 1930s, since Germany rearmed. We're seeing that take place in the PRC right now. Japan has spent a little over 1% of its GDP, which is still a large number given the size of the GDP, but given the challenge presented by China and the massive defense budget that the Chinese have, we need the Japanese to step up, like we've asked our NATO allies to step up and get to the 2% plus number for percentage of GDP spent on defense. But then there are also some smaller things that can be done even within their current budget. The Japanese have very capable Soyuz submarines, but they retire them with plenty of life left on them, plenty of tread left on the tires. if they would extend those retirements on their submarine force by a couple of years for each sub, they could have a dramatic improvement in the number of submarines operating. And these are highly capable, very effective submarines, very silent, with technology that can't be matched for diesel electric subs by any other country in the world. So the more of those we have out there, the more of a deterrent there is to malign activity by the PRC. So we need to work with them on those issues. So with that as a summary, I'll kick it back to Mike to ask the first question of our panel, or to weigh on anything I said. But I just want to emphasize it's a very strong relationship. It's a relationship that I think became stronger over the past 4 years, and properly managed. I'm hopeful that even under the current administration, that the Japanese-American relationship will remain strong, and that the platform that we strengthened continues to be built on by President Biden, Secretary Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and others, and they'll realize the great strategic advantages that come from a strong U.S.-Japan relationship. Mr. Secretary?
Thanks. It's worth noting, I think many of you who've served in government as well would appreciate this. The people matter an awful lot. You heard Robert and I talk about particular names. And my counterparts at state were first Taro Kono and then Motegi-san, both good people who you could pick up the phone. I don't know how many times I talked to Kono, dozens and dozens of times that I talked to Foreign Minister Kono when we were dealing with North Korea. And to your point, Robert, we were always the ones that were just different views between Abe and the leadership in South Korea about how to proceed. And it was always the United States that was able to try and bridge it to make the gap and create the important optic that said we're all three working in the same direction. And those people matter an awful lot. And I could go through a list of countries where we didn't have fantastic counterparts during our time. Even with countries that were really important, this was a place where we were blessed at a time in history when we did have good counterparts. So I think throughout their foreign policy establishment, throughout their national security team, and throughout their intelligence team as well. And so with that, I'm happy to understand Alex Gray, did you have something that you wanted to add, or a comment or a question?
Thanks, Mr. Secretary. Ambassador, my question actually was related to, from both of your perspectives, how the Japanese and the Japan-Taiwan relationship is evolving from how you've seen it in your time in office, and even now into the Biden administration. We saw with the recent prime ministerial visit to Washington, some commentary about how Japan and Taiwan are evolving their partnership and their relationship. I'd just be curious your take on how that evolving situation is going to fit into the broader U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy.
Well, just give two quick thoughts. First, deep commercial relationship between the two places. I saw a note today that was talking about they're trying to work together, TSMC working with the Japanese on some semiconductor work inside of Japan as well, important set of relationships between those two countries. And I think the Japanese watched Hong Kong, and it gave them even heightened sensitivity about the risk throughout the entire set of islands there. I think they saw the risk and realized they were going to have to do more, not only with respect to Taiwan, with respect to the Pacific Islands, with respect to the Philippines, other places as well. I think they watched that political activity inside of Hong Kong and recognized that this wasn't 5 or 10 or 20 years out, but was on top of them in a way maybe they didn't appreciate, or at least maybe the population didn't appreciate enough to give their leadership the space to do the things that they needed to do. I don't know, Robert, if you have any other thoughts or different thoughts on that.
No, I agree with you, Secretary, on the Mike, on the situation in Hong Kong. I think it was a wake-up call, not just for the Japanese, but I think it was a real wake-up call for the people of Taiwan. The idea that somehow the Taiwanese would agree to a one country, two systems resolution of the issues between Beijing and Taipei after seeing what happened in Hong Kong. That potential disappeared with all, for probably 95% of the folks in Taiwan. But I think their allies in Japan and friends in Japan realize that as well. So I think that had a huge impact. And I think there's also been a lot of boisterous talk among national security hawks, and hopefully it's just talk in Beijing about the need to retake Taiwan by force in the coming 4 to 5 years, and I hope that doesn't happen, because that's the sort of thing that could trigger a massive international crisis. And I think that the Japanese are, by standing with Taiwan and leaning forward on Taiwan, are demonstrating a classic peace through strength approach and trying to deter China from taking such action. So I think you're right. I think it's hard to overestimate the impact of Hong Kong on these issues. So
I can't hear.
Morgan Ortegas is the next question that I have in the queue, or the next comment.
Thank you,
good to
sir.
see you. Yes, ma'am.
Hey, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Good to see you too as well, Robert. I know a lot of people are going to have questions on the defense side, so I thought I'd ask for the both of you about the FTA, the free trade agreement that we did with Japan in 2019. Are there ways in which that we can expand upon that? And I also started thinking about the campaign against Huawei that Secretary Pompeo and all of us at the State Department pursued under his leadership. And I was curious if there are ways in which that we can encourage more American and Western businesses to perhaps do more business with China, Korea, Taiwan, instead of having the risk of doing it with the Chinese Communist Party.
Robert, you want to go first? Go ahead.
Yeah, Morgan, I think that's a great question. And again, it was the campaign on Huawei and securing a 5G network with trusted providers, I think, is one of the best examples of an interagency, whole of government approach that was successful that you'll see in the U.S. government across administrations for the past 20 or 30 years. By the time I'd left working for Mike at the State Department and got over to the White House, people basically told us that the Huawei battle, the 5G battle, was over, that the Chinese were going to control 5G everywhere among Western allies, even in the United States, and that we'd have to find some sort of an encryption solution to deal with that. But just understand that the Internet of Things will be controlled 100% by Beijing, and all the data will go up into their clouds, and that there was nothing we could do. And I didn't accept that. The president didn't accept it. Certainly Secretary Pompeo didn't accept it, and he put together a great team at the State Department. Larry Kudlow became a great ally of ours in the White House. And we literally fanned out across the free world, not to sell an American product, because at the time we didn't have a company that was fully making the equipment necessary to put together a 5G network. There was a lot of I kind of felt like sometimes Mike and I were the unpaid spokespeople for Ericsson and Nokia. But we got out to our allies in Europe and Asia, in the South Pacific, and really turned that around and show that America could win and that the Western world could win by focusing on this idea of trusted providers. And at the outset of your question, I think, was, how do we get more of our allies and friends, and how do we move our supply chain to Japan and Taiwan and other countries and away from the PRC. And I think that's something that policymakers need to be looking at, but I think business folks need to be looking at that as well. I mean, if China miscalculates and does attempt to take Taiwan by force, or engages in some sort of blockade of Taiwan, or continues to engage in egregious activity in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, I think it's going to become harder and harder for businesses to justify having their supply chains in China. It's going to become a business risk, in the same way that it was a business risk to do business in South Africa back in the 70s and 80s. And so I think you're going to see smart businesses looking for to diversify their supply chain, if not taking it totally out of China, but at least having backups and alternate supply chains in some of the other nations in the region. But Mike, turn it over to you. I know you and Keith Kroc did a great job on Huawei, and you may want to further elaborate on some of your diplomatic efforts that led to the success.
Robert, you told the Huawei story pretty well. I'll give you the other, Morgan. I'll give you another economic issue that we faced up front with them. Was they didn't want to give up oil from Iran, and I remember tough conversations. This was an important part of their energy mix, how they had thought about life for an awfully long time. Prime Minister Abe, he thought he had a relationship with the Iranians that he didn't want to break. You'll remember he travels over there, and it ends badly. I'll put it that way. Suffice it to say, they didn't, when we put our sanctions on in, would have been 2019 on crude oil, these were tough discussions with the Japanese. And interestingly, in the end, the Japanese did the right thing. They were great partners. They did it right. There were no issues. There wasn't leakage there. But they wanted to make darn sure that if we were going to impose this on them, that we were going to impose it on the Chinese as well. That is, they wanted to make sure that their friend wasn't treated in a way that was different and worse than the Chinese Communist Party was being treated. And so this was a big effort that we made. Again, a very important economic issue for the Japanese, something that they were going to have to explain to their people why they were going to give up this source of stable, reliable, affordable energy for the Japanese people, and a big deal for their trade commissioners as well. And so it was a long, difficult conversation, but in the end, the Japanese did absolutely the right thing, and we were deeply appreciative of that. I'll leave others. I'm sure we'll comment on trade things too. It sounds like Alex Wong, you've got something that you wanted to add to this question, or maybe something different.
Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary, and Robert, thank you, and to everyone for joining tonight. Always good to be with everyone. You know, this conversation, it's striking me. We're talking about issues today and strategic interests that we have with Japan today, but you know, the extent to which the policies we're talking about and the issues we're talking about are influenced by the strategic vision that Nixon and the Nixon presidency had, you know, back in the 70s is pretty remarkable. You know, maybe just for the audience to give a little peek behind how this seminar operates, it's not just called a seminar. It in fact is pretty much operates like an academic seminar. They send out the Nixon Foundation sends out articles for us to read, background reading, and a whole phalanx of very interesting source material from the Nixon era. But you know, the one article, the one document I was really interested to read was this foreign affairs article from President Nixon. He was not president at the time. It was written in 1967 as he was thinking about his second run for the presidency. And it was titled Asia After Vietnam. You know, when you read, at least when I read or come across old foreign policy articles, you know, very few of them have enduring truths. Most of them are actually, you know, they make you chuckle a little bit of how cloistered they are and the trends of that time, and the predictions usually fall pretty flat. But this one is pretty remarkable. You know, first of all, again, it was written in the run-up to Nixon announcing his second run for the presidency. So it's remarkable as a campaign document. You know, its granularity, its detail, the fact that it actually prioritizes strategic issues abroad. That's not something you would see a presidential campaign do in these days, as he had done back then. But it's more remarkable, and if all of you audience members get to pick up a copy, it's remarkable for its clear-sightedness on the priority that Asia should take in the next 30, 40 years. And it's pretty remarkable in its foresight about the strategic landscape that we would face, the United States would face, and the world would face. First of all, it talks about the rise of more Asian regional consciousness post World War II, and I think we've definitely seen that rise, particularly in the post-Cold War era. It focused on the growing threat of China as a security threat to other nations, which was interesting. And it talked about the growing political and practical limitations to U.S. Police actions in Asia in particular, which is definitely something true that we look at today. It talked about the need for informal and formal groupings in Asia to balance China. It talked about, quote, active defense, coordinating with our partners in Asia, while also guarding against accusations of cultural or racist animus against China. And it talked about the need for Japan to rouse itself from its post-World War II era into a new role of a regional leadership, which was the context for the Okinawa Reversion Agreement that we've been talking about. So, I mean, all of those things that Nixon talked about in that article, again, in 1967, ring very true today. I mean, it reads like something someone could have written last year about Asia. You know, a couple points I just want to make. I mean, I think Japan's role today is a little bit different, of course, from that kind of Cold War era, from that Soviet-focused past. You know, I think our alliance was a little simpler back then. You know, we secured their security and in return, we asked them to stand with us against the Soviet Union, but we allowed them to, the Japanese, to turn inward, to rebuild domestically, rebuild their economy. We allowed their foreign policy, or their alliance with us allowed them to have their foreign policy focus on securing commodities and securing markets for an export-led economy, and then to rise up the value chain. Some of that still is true today, but that's less true. It's much more, the U.S.-Japan alliance is much more an enterprising partnership these days. I think there's a unique identity of interest between the U.S. and Japan in the region. This, I think, comes mainly from the fact that Japan is not really export dependent or trade dependent anymore. Its relations abroad are not really so much about securing commodities and markets, although there's some of that. I think it's really focused on securing a regional balance in the Indo-Pacific that is not in favor of itself, but of sovereign nations making sovereign decisions. And that's exactly what the U.S. strategy is. I saw this firsthand, and I think a lot of people on this seminar saw this firsthand in working with the Japanese over the past 4.5 years. One disagreement I have with Nixon in that article, he talks a little bit about how the memories of World War II are fading in Asia, which would open the door to more Japanese engagement across the region. But like Secretary Pompeo, I think that those histories, not just from World War II, but past colonial histories, are still extant in the memories of many people across Asia. And I think Japan is aware of this. But that's why working with us, working in a multilateral setting, working through the Quad to temper those animosities and tensions, I think is really key. And it's great that we have people on this call who worked so forthrightly on that effort. Anyway, not really a question, more just I want to share some thoughts I had in doing the reading, but seeing the arc from Nixon to today into the policies that we all tried to implement in the recent Trump administration.
Alex, this is Robert here on the line. You worked very closely with the Japanese on the North Korea issue when you were the envoy for North Korea. How did you see the Japanese working? Obviously, they weren't the five-party talks, but in our work with the Japanese to confront North Korea and to deal with the DPRK issue, how did you see their diplomacy? And obviously, you weren't there when President Nixon wrote the article in '67. I think Mike and I are probably the only two that were alive at that time. But based on the article, what do you see as the differences between how the Japanese functioned in your rounds of negotiations with them on DPRK and what Nixon might have been thinking in '67?
Well, it's hard to compare. I mean, obviously, I wasn't in the room, with the Nixon team, but one thing I will say, and I think this reflected a little bit in Secretary Pompeo's remarks regarding North Korea in particular, is that you notice in the past 3 or 4 years, North Korea did summits, obviously, with President Trump. Chairman Kim did a summit, multiple summits with President Moon of South Korea. Did multiple summits with Xi Jinping of China, and he did at least one summit, if I remember, it might have been 2, but with Vladimir Putin. Chairman Kim was making the rounds, trying to raise his profile, trying to figure out a way forward, perhaps on a new strategic landscape or balance in Northeast Asia. The one leader he didn't meet was Prime Minister Abe, and he hasn't met with Prime Minister Suga yet. And I think that was a real missed opportunity for North Korea. Japan clearly has an interest in a more stable Northeast region, and they have a lot to offer if North Korea takes the deal where they give up their WMD programs. And the fact that Chairman Kim didn't want to sit down with Prime Minister Abe, even though Prime Minister Abe, from a political standpoint, had made promises regarding a rapprochement with North Korea, that was a real missed opportunity for Chairman Kim. It was also something that we would have liked to have seen. And the more contact at the leader level that can then melt the ice between the diplomats in North Korea and the rest of the world, but in particular Japan, perhaps we could have shaken things up and found a way forward, but a real missed opportunity there.
Yeah, Alex, that's a good point. We were working so closely with the Japanese too. We were going to count on them to be one of the underwriters, guarantors, central participants if we were successful with the North Koreans, and the fact that they didn't have direct conversations at a very senior level certainly didn't facilitate what we were trying to do. It's a really good point. Next to John Noonan. John, good evening. John, we can't hear you.
Hear me now?
We've got you now. Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you, Ambassador Bryan and you. Always a pleasure to do these at the beginning of the month. They're turning into a highlight. So I have a two-part question, one on the diplomatic side and one on the military side. I'd like to direct it both you, Mr. Secretary, and you, Ambassador O'Brien. On the diplomatic side, it's been almost 4 years to the month when there was a major announcement made on the Quad at the ASEAN summit in Doha. And my question on the diplomatic side, on the Quad itself, it seems like it's stuck in this purgatory between a dialogue and what I think at least 3 out of the 4 players would like to see, which is more of a NATO-like, obviously not NATO identical, but NATO-like framework where there's more of a collective defense element to it. And every year we see the Chinese take another step, whether it be the seizure of Hong Kong or whether it be developing the largest navy in the world as of fall of 2020. And every step they take as they inch a little closer to being a threat that can dominate not just the United States, but all of its allies in the region. I think there's a tendency to say, well, at last, the Quad is finally going to become it's going to become a real alliance. So the question, and it might be a parochial one, I freely admit it, is 4 years on after the leaders of the Quad agreed to reinvigorate the dialogue into something more meaningful, how would you rate the progress, and what do you think the next practical steps are? And they don't even have to be steps forward, they can be steps backwards for that matter. Second question is on the military side, and I hope you all will indulge me. My brother-in-law is an Air Force captain. He's stationed in Okinawa. He flies the F-15C Eagle, air-to-air superiority fighter. So he's had some interesting stories over the South China Sea with a increasingly capable PLA Air Force. And forgive me, I'm channeling the question of a fighter pilot captain, which I'm sure you all know they can be blunt. And I'll just put the military question to you this way from him. If China invades Taiwan, are the Japanese going to let us fight? So with that, I direct it to you, Mr. Secretary, and you, Ambassador O'Brien. Thank you all so much.
Thanks. Let me try to take the first one, and then Robert, you can take the second one. That I know Matt Pottinger wants to get in. I bet he has some thoughts on the second question as well, as he was dealing with some of these issues pretty closely. Look, the Quad it's a dance to grow it and strengthen it. You have reluctance. You mentioned one partner. There's frankly reluctance everywhere. Everybody's trying to figure out how to make this work. What does Article 5 mean in this context, or the equivalent thereof, right? What is that? How does that shake out? Who's going to underwrite this thing? Who's going to resource it? What does it mean for the rest of the nations in the region as well? How do you think about that? So our effort was to, and by the way, our effort was greatly benefited. We made progress that I'm proud of, but Xi Jinping gave us an enormous energy, right? When ultimately the Chinese and the Indians have conflict in the Himalayas, the tone from the Indians just radically changed. But these things take time. There's long histories. There's deep connections between the two countries. Prime Minister Modi's it's a complicated place, both militarily and commercially with the Chinese. And so building this out takes everybody moving forward together. What I was happy about is it wasn't just senior levels that were beginning to talk about the Quad. We really had the collective administrations, the bureaucracies, starting to have real conversations about what shape this might take. So will there be an economic piece to this? I think there's a good argument that we could do lots of good together economically to confront the challenges of China together. How would we diplomatically work alongside each other, knowing that there were, everyone was going to show up to say, just like the history of NATO, yes, sign me up too. I want to be part of this. How it's the Quad. That's the name of it. That has, in English language, that has a numerical element to it. Ought there to be others? And what would they be? Would they be partners? Would they be adjuncts? Would we give them tenure, right? As faculty would think about it. And we were beginning to make progress. By the way, they were looking at the United States very clearly too, and could see that there was a time limit to an administration. And I think they wanted to see that this was going to be an enduring set of policies that wouldn't change as administrations changed. And so they wanted to see that if this is the way we went forward, would there be a longevity? Could we get the House and the Senate to sign up for things that looked like guarantees that were historical? All of these were things we wanted to test them too. And so we've begun to make real progress on each of what I think would be 3 or 4 major fronts, but it ended there. And I hope the next administration, they've said good things about this. They've applauded. Frankly, it's one of the few things they've given the Trump administration some credit for. I hope they'll seriously work to go build this out. Maybe I'll stop there, Robert. I'll let you can add to that, talk about the military question, and then Matt Pottinger, you're up next.
Thanks, Secretary Pompeo. And I'll just add one note on the Quad. I think that one of the real strategic, it's not a tactical mistake, but a strategic mistake that the Chinese made was engaging the Indians in the line of actual control in that brutal ambush that took place last fall. I think not only did they lose a lot of their supporters or folks that were sympathetic to them in the Indian government, I think the Indian people saw that attack for what it was, especially the brutal nature of the attack, which played out across Indian tabloids. And I think there became a real distaste for Chinese methods and that sort of power projection in India. So I agree with everything the Secretary said about the complicated relationship that India and China have and President Modi's position there. But President Modi's a pretty tough guy, as we learned, as Mike learned, as I learned, and I think the Chinese made a very big mistake with that action, and whether it was a rogue commander or this was some sort of probe that was approved at the highest levels of the CCP, we don't know at this point, but it was definitely a mistake, and China's going to pay for that. And I think it adds impetus to the Quad. And I do agree with Mike that the Secretary Pompeo that the initial soundings from the administration, the new administration, the Biden administration, are very positive when it comes to the Quad and strengthening of those relationships. And I hope they follow through. And I wish them luck on that front and Godspeed in that endeavor, because it's a very powerful grouping of countries. When you take Australia, Japan, India, and the United States and put them together, that creates a real alternative for other countries in the Indo-Pacific to look at that grouping and the freedom that we all represent, the fact that we're 4 great democracies, and compare that to what they're seeing in China. And so it's an important initiative. I'm glad to see it moving forward. On the military side, I'll let our Marine Matt Pottinger respond to our Air Force missileer John Noonan on that one. But I will say that we've been ambiguous for a reason, and how we would respond to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. But as the PLA Navy has gotten bigger and improved, don't underestimate the United States. Don't miscalculate. We still have some pretty impressive tools in our toolkit when it comes to defending ourselves at the high seas, below the high seas, in the air, on land, and so I think, and we've demonstrated throughout our history the ability to fight and fight hard, and no adversary should underestimate the United States military. But with that, I'll pass it over to Major Pottinger for his thoughts.
Robert, thanks, and Secretary Pompeo, thanks so much for a great conversation and for sharing this tonight. Hey, John, your what I would tell your brother-in-law, or a couple of things. One, that there's a saying in the Japanese military that Taiwan's defense is Japan's defense, and I think that Japan will act accordingly. And there's the People's Liberation Army Air Force that your brother-in-law's flying and seeing up there in the skies over the East China Sea and throughout the Western Pacific, there's a manual that PLA Air Force officers are issued that explains why Taiwan is so important as a target to be annexed by the Communist Party, and it's all about Japan. And if you read the excerpt of that manual, it basically says that China is going to take Taiwan in order to render Japan unable to wage war, unable to even defend itself, unable to even supply itself. That if Taiwan were taken, basically China would be able to dominate the region and render Japan irrelevant. So that's a talking point he should mention to his Japanese buddies, when they're going out to the bars in Naha in southern Okinawa. One other point I wanted to make was that there was a lot of press coverage. It was really this myth in the press coverage as we were going into the election last year that somehow the Trump administration had badly strained our alliances in the Indo-Pacific region. It's nonsense. I've never seen an empirical fact produced to suggest that our alliances did anything other than strengthen over the course of the Trump administration. Our relationship with India has never been stronger. Secretary Pompeo, you led the first 2 ever cabinet level meetings of the Quad. The relationship with Vietnam, Vietnamese officials told me regularly that the relationship had never been better. Taiwan, officials in Taiwan have told me the same thing. Career officers in Australia, and most of all in Japan. And I'll just leave you with one point. Some of the key pillars of our strategy in the Indo-Pacific region were ideas that we borrowed and adapted and shared and collaborated on with Japan. So the whole idea of a quadrilateral format is an idea that Prime Minister Abe came up with during his first stint as prime minister. He was the longest serving prime minister in Japanese history. And that was an early idea that he got to see reach fruition before he stepped down. The idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, that concept, that catchphrase, we consciously adopted it and adapted it from the minds of our closest allies in Japan. That was a phrase that Prime Minister Abe was using first. So that's a sign of a partnership that is evolved in ways that are going to allow us as equal partners. Of course, with the United States still providing the majority of the defense, but we want to see Japan step up and spend more and more on their defense in order to forestall the sort of catastrophe that PLA Air Force manual describes.
Thanks, Matt. Look, we've got just a bit. We've got a couple in the queue. Let me go to Congressman Waltz. Michael, there you go.
Yeah. Hey, thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you, Robert, for co-hosting. I just wanted to build on my good VMI man Noonan's question there, and Matt, please feel free to jump in as well. Where is, just politically within Suga, I know Abe chipped away at it a bit in terms of redefining, but where is Japan now with Article 9? And it is, look, I'm taking a hard look at the Navy's issues, our Navy's issues with readiness. There is real pressure on the top line of the defense budget. It seems to me if the Quad is truly going to realize kind of its full potential, we need to see a shift internally in the Japanese political space in terms of Article 9 and in terms of its own defense spending, which is still hovering around 1%. I think there's a slight bump to 1.1%. So I would just love to know what conversations you had with the Japanese along those lines. And then my second question is shifting focus a bit to the Japanese relationship with Russia. And do you see a tendency as we're all are dealing with the CCP threat, for the Japanese. Where do you see in response to that, or just in general, the Japanese relationship with Russia going, particularly as the northern trade routes open, which from my conversations with a number of Japanese officials is very, very attractive to Tokyo, and it is leading them, to kind of really seek a rapprochement with Moscow.
Let me just take 2 seconds on the second one. I think your point's precisely right. I think certainly the trade routes matter. I think there are lots of reasons that you see the Japanese trying to find places they can work with the Russians. And I don't think there's any doubt about that. You use the word rapprochement. That might be I might overstate it just a bit, at least where they sit today. But that's certainly the direction of travel. It was certainly the direction of travel. I know this better than others. It was certainly the direction of travel for my counterpart, and I think for Prime Minister Abe as well. Robert, you want to jump in?
No, I agree with you, Mike, and I think obviously there's the issue on Sakhalin Island with Japan and Russia that hasn't been solved since the Second World War, and that's something that's important to the Japanese, but the Russians have been stubbornly hanging on to that territory for many, many years now. They did not have the equivalent of our reversion treaty with Okinawa when it came to that island. I do think that the Russians, as close as they've gotten to the Chinese, and I think one of the great concerns that we have from a geopolitical standpoint is that what's become an increasingly close relationship between the Russians and the Chinese. We also have to understand that the Russians and Chinese do not have mutually aligned interests in many places. Most importantly, I think, is in the Arctic, and this is something that both Matt and I raised with our Russian counterparts on a regular basis to explain to the Russians that as important as they feel the Arctic is, and they take very expansive claims in the Arctic, we would remind them what the Chinese have done in the South China Sea, what they've done in the East China Sea, how they're behaving in Antarctica, and asking the Russians if they're really confident in that alliance with that budding alliance with China, and how much of the Arctic they wanted to cede to the Chinese. And the Russians didn't seem too interested in ceding any of their Arctic territories to the Chinese, so, or at least their Arctic claims. So I think that's an area where Japan and Russia have a interest aligned, but they also have differences, territorial differences as well. And that's the tough thing about dealing with Russia that Secretary Pompeo saw, that I saw, is that there were places where our interest overlapped with the Russians, and in those cases we wanted to try and work together, but there were always, with the Russians, it was never easy, because there were always plenty of areas where they were engaged in malign activity that we had to push back on. So it didn't make it easy, but I think that's something we need to keep pointing out to the Russians, is that the Chinese are not their friend when it comes to territorial claims, and the projection of Chinese influence, especially into the Arctic and Antarctic regions. So that's what I'd add to the Secretary's comments there.
Congressman Walz, I'll just add, as for Article 9, you said they were chipping away at it. It's not that provision any longer that I think constrains the Japanese capacity for defense. It's their leaders' willingness to go make the case to the Japanese people that 1% just doesn't get it done. It's not enough. There is still a mindset that is, a pacifist doesn't describe it accurately, but that mindset where leaders go out and make the case to the people that we need to spend more of our money, more of our budget, a higher percentage of our GDP on defense is the argument that has to be made. I don't see it being the language in their constitution in Article 9 being the thing that gets in their way. Abe proved that. Now it's a matter of leaders stepping up. And with that, let me turn next to Mary Kissel, and then try and get to Christian right after Mary.
Thanks, Mr. Secretary. Thanks, Ambassador O'Brien. It's great to be with the group. Mr. Secretary, just to build off of what you just said, the big forces today are just as obvious as they were to Nixon when he was writing, China's authoritarian and bad, Japan is democratic and good, and yet, 5 decades later, we still don't have these democracies knit together, and we don't have the kind of domestic political dynamics within Japan to get them to rearm and take the more aggressive posture that we need them to take. Yes, there are cultural influences here, but why would we expect their behavior to change if we don't change the incentives for them? And that's really the question I wanted to pose to you and to Ambassador O'Brien. I mean, strategically, we're still in the same place we were post-World War II. We provide this great security umbrella. We've allowed them to pursue really terrible economic policies that have just crushed growth. Abe's great on the military, but he's terrible on growth. So, let me just pose that to you and to the ambassador. Yeah, okay, there are some cultural issues, but if you really want to change the incentive structure here on the economy to get them to dump the Keynesian garbage, or on the military to get them to stand up, what do we need to do? Is it a free trade pact? Do we need to pull back? Do we need to have the Quad take on more of these military engagements, see what they feel like without us doing everything for them, sir?
Mary, I think I remember you writing a memo for me on this issue. It's funny. You talk about their economic model, their Keynesian model. I hope we can convince the American people to reject that, let alone the Japanese people. Your point's well taken. I mean, look, this is we always confront this. I remember the stories about how we were trying to destroy NATO when we were simply asking them to do what needed to be done. The same idea, the same concept has to apply here. It has to be the case that the expectations for not just the Japanese, but for the Australians, for the South Koreans, lots of countries understand that it's in their best interest to do the right thing vis Chinese Communist Party and spend more money on their own defense and thereby bolster the regional defenses. We've got to figure out a way to do that, and it's a matter of rate of change and how much carrot and how much stick. We have ample supplies of each. We just need to use them in a way that's effective, and it's a complicated issue, as you well know. Robert, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up NATO, Mike. Some of my favorite pictures are of us in London at the last NATO summit, and we looked like we were storming in and out of meetings with set jaws and that sort of thing, because those are pretty tough negotiations to try and get. It wasn't just the Japanese that we had to deal with on this defense spending issue, trying to get the Germans to just maintain their submarines and get them out to sea and get our allies, many excluded. We finally got up through a lot of great diplomacy with the Pentagon, but also with Mike and his team at NATO. We got, I think, up to 9 or 10 countries that were spending 2%. The French are almost at 2% and will be in a year or two. So we did show that it was possible to move the needle and encourage our allies to invest in their own protection and their own defense. I think the best advocate we have on that side, though, is the Communist Party of China and the way that they've been treating their neighbors in the region. So, for example, we've seen Australia go over 2% in defense spending, buying really high-tech U.S. platforms, from the Poseidon to the F-35 Lightnings to they're actually developing their own program with Boeing that's being funded by the Australians, not by the U.S., called Loyal Wingman, for UAVs that'll accompany fighter jets on missions. So the Chinese have issued a wake-up call to folks in the region. I think that's what will ultimately encourage their spending. But we're going to have to use carrots and sticks, as you suggest, Marion, as the Secretary suggests, to get our allies spending what they want to. The problem is, for politicians, it's a lot easier to promise new elementary schools and stimulus payments and parks and roads than it is to talk about the need to invest in defense. And we've seen that across the world, where it's and it's all good right up until the point that it isn't, when there's an enemy on your frontier and you're not prepared to repel them. And so we've certainly got to do our best as diplomats to make that case. But I think in some ways some of the aggressor nations out there are making the case for us, and we'll hopefully see our allies participate at a level similar to what the American taxpayer does, so that we don't bear all the burden, for sure.
Thanks, Robert. Christian, you're up.
Great. Thank you, Secretary Pompeo. Excuse me. Mary stole a little bit of my thunder, but just picking up on that, and I don't want to beat up on the Japanese, but just to preface this, one of my favorite allies, one of the governments I'd like to deal with most, more important, I think, in the 21st century as an ally than Great Britain, third largest economy, but enormously frustrating to deal with at times. I dealt with this a little myself, not so much in the early Trump administration, but in the Bush administration, just asking for simple things like cooperation and broadcasting in medium wave into North Korea for human rights issues. If you look at their situation, yeah, they have a big economy, 1%, you could talk 1%, 2%. It's sort of, you also raises the question of what you're going to do with it, even if it were 2 or 3 or 4%. They don't have solid missile defense. They're hemming and hawing and sort of not buying Aegis ashore. They don't have even a conventional capability to attack or to strike Chinese cities. They failed at their constitutional reform. As you point out, that's not necessarily the end-all be-all of whether or not they're going to be useful. But look at a Taiwan contingency. They have essentially no communications, or at least no serious communications, it seems, with Taiwan. It makes our communications, which I would also say are unserious, look robust. Why do you think that in a crisis, Japan wouldn't have an incentive to sit on the sidelines? I mean, I think they'd be better than Korea. Korea, I don't think, will even let us use our bases. I think our forces in Korea are useless in a Chinese contingency. Japan would be different. But the idea that they would come into action on an emergency basis as we're rushing to shore up Taiwan's ability to survive, is that realistic, or are we fooling ourselves? Because if we're fooling ourselves, shouldn't we focus more on buttressing Taiwan and realizing we need a unified military command with Taiwan and forces in Taiwan, as opposed to sort of a hope that the Australians and the Japanese and the Koreans are going to come to our assistance?
Well, Christian, I'll give you 2 thoughts, and then I want to get to the last couple folks. You raised some truly strategically important questions. With all of these things, no one knows until one really knows. The need to do either or of these, I think, is the mistake, right? I actually think you can do everything you can to drive the Japanese to the right place. I think we ought to absolutely do more with Taiwan. We tried to do that. We made some progress. We didn't get all the way home, for sure. There's an awful lot of space left there. And I actually think they're mutually reinforcing. I think to the extent we do that, I think this cuts across a little bit the wrong way, a little bit to the extent the Japanese see us doing more with Taiwan. They'll say, great, the Americans took that on. Now we can spend 0.5% or 0.75% instead of 1%. So I get how it cross cuts. But I also think it would give enormous confidence to these countries if the United States were to do more to support Taiwan. I think they would be emboldened. I think it would give us the capacity to say, we're going to continue to do this, but we can make it contingent. I think there's lots of ways that you can get to the strategic idea that you have, which is, in a pinch, at the end of the day, the United States makes make sure we have every capacity to do what the United States needs to have done. And we need to spend this period, this moment, between now and that moment, whenever that may come, making sure we're in the right place to do that. We should count on our friends, but in the end, we've seen this before. We're going to get it right, and we need to make sure we're capable and in a position to get it right as well. Anyway, I hope that answers your question, at least in part, at least how I think about it. Monica, Ms. Crowley, you're next. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much. So nice to see you, Ambassador O'Brien. Nice to see you too. I think I have more of a theoretical question. So we know that the primary objective of President Nixon's opening to China was to enlist China as a counterweight against growing Soviet power. And that gave rise to very effective and very elegant triangular diplomacy between the three. You've both spoken very effectively about the Quad and the importance of the Quad as a new multilateral counterweight against growing Chinese power. We also know that leadership in these democracies changes. And we also know that the more players you add, the more complex it gets. So you've spoken to your optimism about the short term for the Quad, but how optimistic are you about the medium and long-term sustainability about the Quad? That's number one. And Robert, to your point about Russia, should the United States be more aggressive in exploiting what divides China and Russia and try to perhaps create a new Sino-Russian split that we might be able to really, truly exploit? Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Robert, you want to go ahead and try to answer both of those?
Sure. And let me start on the second question. Look, we know that there's a lot of Russian territory today that came to Russia from China as a result of the Treaty of Peking. I think that was an 1865 treaty. So I think that's something the Russians should be concerned about, given the historical claims to territory that the Chinese have been asserting around the region. That's something, if I was a Russian, I'd be very concerned about Chinese claims in Siberia and other parts of Russia. So that's something that we can certainly point out to our Russian friends. And the problem with our Russian friends is that they're also in Syria and engaged in malign activity, and they're in Ukraine engaged in malign activity, and they're trying to they're taking a page from the Chinese on the South China Sea and trying to do that to the Black Sea and threatening the Baltic. So we've got a lot of difficulties with the Russians, but at the same time, as Secretary Pompeo pointed out, and I mentioned, we do have areas of interest that overlap. And Monica, I think you're right when you talk about the elegant diplomacy that was employed by Kissinger and Nixon and bringing China into play in that U.S.-Soviet Cold War struggle. And there may be ways that we can engage the Russians and at least sow some doubt between them and their newfound Chinese friends. So I think it's I think it's something that's worth talking about. Very quickly on your first question about the long-term viability of the Quad, I believe in free men and women and free markets and free peoples, and I think even though freedom comes under attack and democracy can be messy. I'm optimistic about the United States. I'm optimistic about our democratic allies. And when you look at the Quad with India, which is a massive country and a messy democracy, but a democracy nonetheless, and Australia, which we inherited, common, going back to the Magna Carta, common rule of law values and democratic values with our Australian friends, and you look at the way that the Japanese took to democracy after a terrible experience with Imperial Japan and the warlords that ran that country into the ground in World War II, and how they've really developed into a great democratic nation. I would bet on the democracies every day of the week, notwithstanding the fact that there are some days when you think, gosh, how are we going to get through this? But I think there's a tremendous long-term viability to that arrangement. And Mr. Secretary, talking about Nixon, we actually have Christopher Nixon Cox here at the library with me, and the grandson of the president, who's one of our panelists and a board member of the foundation. So maybe we could turn to him to ask the next question or make a comment if that's
that's
acceptable
great
to you, Mike.
Of course, that's great. Chris?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Secretary. I actually wanted to ask a question of Alex Gray because I really wanted to highlight a great article that he wrote on the U.S. South Pacific holdings and what was happening with them over the last few months. And it was an excellent article, and I want to highlight it because when you think about the Pacific, you think of Japan, you think of the United States, you think of China, but our South Pacific holdings are so important as a projection of power, of U.S. power. And unfortunately, for a long time, they went very underappreciated by the American political system. But I think one of the great things, certainly with Matt Pottinger's efforts and others in the Trump administration, is that there was a focus that was put on these islands. And of course, China's putting a tremendous focus on these islands. So I just was hoping that Alex Gray could talk a little bit about what's going on there, and then maybe how the United States and Japan could work to bolster those islands as a projection of power for the United States.
Chris, thanks. Alex, if you can do that, and if you can do it in 120 seconds, that'd be even better.
I will do it. I will do it faster than that, Mr. Secretary. And I would just want to quickly say, Mr. Secretary, your visit to the Marshall Islands was a huge part of that strategy, and that was a big deal in the last administration. No, I appreciate the question, and I think one of the most interesting things that I learned in studying the region and visiting the region was that the Chinese have to some extent adopted the Japanese strategy from World War II and how they're using the second island chain and how they're thinking about it strategically. And Matt Pottinger and I actually heard from a senior allied official a comment that will always stick with me, that if you take a map of how the Japanese were projecting power in about 1940 through dominating the former German colonial possessions in the second island chain, and you overlay that with where the Chinese are now interested in basing and One Belt, One Road activity it's almost a complete overlap. And so the possessions that we've had since the end of World War II, plus our territories in Guam and the American Samoa, those are incredibly important for maintaining American power and American both economic and military and diplomatic power. So it's incredibly important. And I think we took a really positive step in the previous administration that I hope will be continued with the high-level focus that folks like Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador O'Brien put on the second island chain.
Alex, great, thanks. Yes, real estate matters. Some things never change. Last question, Nadia Shadlow, please. Closing comments too, if you'd like.
It's okay. I'll ask a last question. Some of my questions about defense, I think, Mary and Mike Waltz and Christian address some of them. I will point out a quote, or actually a great book also to look at, Richard Nixon's Real Peace book. It's a short book, but it really is on this subject of allies, balance of power, regional balances of power. And in that book, he has a great quote. He says, "Handshakes do not change national ambitions. And when two leaders sit down to talk, they do not turn into philanthropists." And I think that that's probably important for us to remember as we seek to, get Japan to try to do something, or cajole other countries to try to do something, because there's a sense of, the degree to which interests are immutable or not, and how do you get the Japanese to think this is actually in our national interest to do? And I think that was covered a lot. So in line with that, just as a divergent, an related area we touched upon early, but what about supply chains, right? So as the Japanese work through their domestic policy issues and the difficulties of increasing their defense budgets and all that we talked about, where are they in terms of leadership on some of the critical supply chain issues in your discussions with them over the past few years? Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. And Nadia, you wrote some of the strategy that we were all working on for these 4 years. Bless you for that. Robert, you want to take the first swing, and then I'll finish up.
Sure. So one of my last trips as National Security Advisor was to Vietnam and to the Philippines, where we saw the Japanese heavily involved in moving their supply chains to those countries and others. But we were also accompanied by Kim Reed from the Exim Bank, who I think is on the line. Kim, do you want to just give a very short response to Nadia on the supply chain issue and on Japanese nearshoring and onshoring and both Japan and other allies moving their supply chain, the font, so to speak, from China into other regions?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Ambassador O'Brien. It was a great privilege to travel with you, not only to the Philippines and to Vietnam, but also to participate by your side at the 14th Annual East Asia Summit, which was held in Bangkok. But I saw you interact with Prime Minister Abe and all the leaders of Asia. And as we know, and as Nadia is one of the main authors of the draft the president approved of the national security strategy, economic security is national security. And we saw over my tenure at the Export-Import Bank, the importance of working with allies and partners, including Japan. For those of you who don't follow Exim closely, there are two export credit agencies in Japan, the Nippon Export and Investment Insurance Group, and then JBIC, Japan Bank for International Cooperation. And it's so important as we look at supply chains, not only what China is doing with their export credit agencies and furthering the Belt and Road around the world, but it is so important that we do co-financing deals with our allies and partners. And in fact, had the opportunity to participate with JBIC on talking about advanced nuclear energy technology and the importance of working with countries like Japan. And so I hope in the Biden administration, this cooperation on the economic front, whole of government will continue. It's very, very important. I know that we're short on time, but I also just wanted to build on Alex Wong's comment at the start of this program time that this is a seminar. And I just want to share for the viewers something that President Nixon wrote in 1967, because I think we really need to be thinking about this all the time. He said back in 1967, many Americans were primarily Europeanist in their approach to foreign affairs, dismissing Asia as a relatively unimportant. But the United States is a Pacific power. And rapid changes were taking place in Asia, where more than half the human race lived, that might well determine the world's future. So as we look towards the future, I would just be really interested in getting your thoughts on the United States being not only a member of the Quad, but the Pacific power. And you will see in the news that perhaps President Biden may nominate Mayor Rahm Emanuel to be the next ambassador to Japan. This was in the press recently. So I hope that when he is before the former U.S. ambassador to Japan, Senator Hagerty, that there will be a good discussion on this. But again, I just love your thoughts on that generally, the United States as a Pacific power.
Well, that's a fine question, I think, for us to close out on. Yes, I think that'll be a lively debate at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee between Rahm Emanuel and Senator Hagerty. Look, I grew up in Southern California. I spent a lot of time in the Pacific. My mother would tell you too much. But this is an important place for us for all the reasons we've talked about tonight. There's certainly deep security implications for the United States. There are important commercial implications for the United States. We saw an administration for 8 years talk about a pivot to Asia. I must say, as I met with my counterparts in the region, they for love nor money couldn't tell you what that pivot meant. I hope that they are telling this administration that we had it right, that the direction of travel, that the things we were doing to help build out the relationships and to demonstrate American resolve in the Pacific, whether it's in the far west or even closer to home in the Pacific. I hope the world could see we were much more serious about it. And as you, my colleagues at the Nixon Seminar, all made clear tonight, this is truly critical for the United States to secure American freedom, to get this right in the Pacific. And this conversation tonight was an important part of helping elucidate all the opportunities, all the risks, and all the tools that we have to try and make that stronger, better, and even build on what we had accomplished. So thank you all for being with me this evening. Thanks for everyone who joined into this conversation and was listening. Everyone have a good evening. So long.